Greetings, transporters. It's Dr. Kelsey Ralph. Today, we're going to talk about minimum parking requirements. The idea behind minimum parking requirements is simple. When a developer builds a new building or retrofits an existing building for a new use, they have to provide a certain number of parking spots. The requirements differ depending on the type of development. Here are the parking requirements for single-family detached homes in New Brunswick, New Jersey, the home of Rutgers University. These requirements seem reasonable. A 2-bedroom house needs 1.5 parking spots. As we add bedrooms, we add parking. The purpose of parking minimums is well-intentioned. Planners are trying to avoid parking spillover. That is, when people are looking for free on-street parking because there isn't enough room to park at the new development. But we'll see that there are some serious problems. But before that, we need to figure out where parking minimums come from. Cities typically get their parking minimums from 2 places, either cities nearby or the Parking Generation Handbook by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. Here's how ITE develops parking generation rates. First, people survey parking occupancy all across the country. That just means they count the number of vehicles parked in a parking lot and then report it to ITE. ITE takes that information to find an average occupancy and relates it to some characteristic of the development, like store size or number of bedrooms. Then, cities take that information and base their parking minimums on the ITE parking generation rate. In other words, the average parking occupancy observed in the studies becomes the new required minimum. Today, we're going to talk about 6 problems of using the ITE parking generation rate to set minimum parking requirements. The first problem is that most parking occupancy surveys happen in the suburbs with a single dedicated parking lot with free parking. Almost everyone arrives here by car, and so parking occupancy is pretty high. But we use that information to set parking minimums here in the city, where some people arrive by bus, some people walk, and there are multiple uses and shared parking lots. Another problem is that we tend to conduct parking occupancy surveys on busy days. Maybe there's a big sale, maybe it's Christmas. But we use that information to set parking minimums for every single day. In other words, we are requiring developers to provide enough parking to handle the busiest day of the year. A third problem is that the parking is almost always free. We tend to think of parking occupancy as being equal to parking demand, but that's not quite right. If we were an economist, we would say that parking occupancy equals the quantity of parking demanded at a price of 0. Donald Shoup, the godfather of parking policy, likens this to the demand for chocolate. He says, imagine if we observed a small, non-random sample of overindulgent people and measure how much chocolate they consume each day. All of the chocolate is free, but they must pay for everything else. The peak quantity of chocolate consumed by this group is not a good indication of the demand for chocolate, just as parking generation rates do not measure the demand for parking. Now let's shift to thinking about the problem with methods. We would expect parking generation rates to come from a lot of studies, but in reality, many of them are based on very few observations. In fact, Shoup notes that half of the parking occupancy studies were based on 4 or fewer observations, and 1 in 5 of them were based on a single location. Another problem is that we expect a clear relationship between some characteristic of the development and parking occupancy, a nice tight correlation that explains a lot of the variation. But in reality, the data is all over the map. There is often a very weak relationship between the size of the store and the parking occupancy. An R-squared of 0.04 means that the size of the store explains just 4% of the variation in the number of parking spots occupied. The 6th and final problem is that we expect clear data from accurate reporters, but in reality, anyone can submit parking occupancy data, so it tends to be fuzzy. And as we know, garbage in, garbage out. Let's use another metaphor. Shoup refers to parking as an all-you-can-park buffet. Both food and parking do produce benefits, but more is not always better. We don't treat demand for food as the amount of food that someone consumes on the peak eating day. Thanksgiving is not a good indication of our demand for food. Similarly, Black Friday is not a good indication of our demand for parking. And finally, we do not require restaurants to provide as much free food as we can eat, but we do require them to provide as much free parking as we can handle on the peak day. Later, we'll see how parking minimums are incredibly expensive to provide, how they lower developmental densities and create sprawl, and how they increase car ownership and driving. So to recap, well-intentioned planners introduce parking minimums to avoid spillover. Parking minimums seem reasonable, but there are several problems. Parking occupancy studies are carried out in suburban areas with free parking where nearly everyone drives. Worse still, they're carried out on the busiest days of the year. And we use that data to set parking minimums for cities for every single day of the year. Methodologically, there are challenges with low sample sizes and the low correlation between characteristics of the development and parking occupancy. Until next time, safe travel.